About now. Hello, hello everybody. Welcome to the FAB Academy Recitations. Another week. This week is very special. We have a great innovator in the future of food. Caleb Harper from the Open Agriculture Group at MIT is joining us for another week of discussion of the future of fabrication and its implications seen in everyone's life. So, Caleb, you have a huge amount of people connected to the FabLab network, looking forward to change anything using digital fabrication. So they are all yours. Thank you very much for joining us. And I leave yourself to introduce yourself and to say hello to this network.
All right, awesome. So I'm Caleb Harper. I'm a principal research scientist over here at the Media Lab, looking at kind of new fabrication methods for food. So if you think about kind of the academic version of what I do, it's called control environment agriculture. And then we're kind of marrying that with cyber physical systems. So trying to create little greenhouses with brains. But let me start with some slides. So I'll switch into, let's see. I'll just go into screen share then?
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah.
Okay. All right, let me just share my screen. Ooh, which just got super weird.
Yeah, but that exactly when you change to the slides, it will stop. Exactly.
Okay. Okay, so are you seeing a full screen version or no?
No, we're seeing like we're seeing it inverse, so you have to switch it. It should be fine.
Okay, how about now?
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. So I thought I'd start off with some kind of general topics about food right now and then work into the technology. So, you know, I feel like constantly in the news we're hearing about food crisis, but depending on where you are and what you think is food crisis, it can be pretty confusing. So, you know, some places in the world we talk about not enough food, other places we talk about having too much food or childhood obesity rates. We talk about agricultural runoff going into the oceans, creating toxic oceans, creating algae blooms. Obviously, in many parts of the world, not even having enough water for agriculture. You know, you keep going down this list. You know, is GMO saving the world? That's you know, a large part of kind of what's popular. But then, of course, GMO being a problem for the world. You know, farmers' land rights being taken from the rainforests. It goes on. You know, pollution, attenuation of nutrition, and I think this conversation takes it out of an individual's realm. It takes it out of a realm where you say, hey, I'm a maker, I can hack this, I want to make a difference. And so I try to boil it down to two pretty simple things that I like to think about, which, you know, help me in the group. And there's about 15 of us now in the Open Agriculture Lab working on this. So I think food crisis can be represented much more simply in two slides. So let's try it. If I ask you how old the average apple is in a grocery store in the United States, and I mean old from the date it was picked to the date that you ate it, you know, how old would you think that was? Like 1 to 3 weeks, 3 weeks to 2 months, 2 months to 6 months, 6 months to 9 months, or over a year? And the truth is, the average age of an apple in the United States is 14 months. 14 months from the date it was picked to the date that you ate it. And that's because we have a huge system for taking these apples and warehousing them and passing them. And I actually think it's a miracle that all of us have apples all year round, because you know, we really wouldn't normally. But the problem with that apple and the way that we've designed our food system is that all of the antioxidants are gone at that point. So what was really good about that apple, what was really healthful about that apple to us, is gone. It's basically just a little ball of sugar at that point. So this tells you that because we've created a global farm, and our food is coming from thousands of miles away, and we've tricked it biologically into doing some things, we've also dramatically decreased the value of that food to people. Here's the other one. So this is a study in the US of what government regulation people would support in food. If you look at the first one, it's pretty normal. I mean, well, not normal, but it's indicative of the politics in the United States right now. A tax on sugared soda. 40% of people would support a tax on sugared soda, 60% wouldn't. They added a control question down in line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, line 7. Mandatory labeling on food containing DNA. So 80% of the population of the United States would support mandatory labeling on food containing DNA. Everything contains DNA that we eat. Well, everything that's alive. And so this tells me that, one, our system has gotten really big and it fails locally. And two, that basically no one knows anything about food. You got 80% of a population that really knows nothing. So this is kind of the thesis of our work at OpenAG, which is what's missing is a platform. Some kind of open source platform to empower a lot of people to start getting educated and a lot of people to become more powerful in the future of food. So these are our 3 research themes, research questions anyway. One is, what if climate was democratic? So what we're working on, this idea of control environment agriculture, if you look at this map, this is a map of the most productive agricultural landscapes in the world. The most productive in green, the least productive in red. And what's happening all over the world, you know, Californian farmers have become Mexican farmers. China is now the largest landholder by lease or owner in Brazil. Much of the Middle East goes into Africa to produce its food. So we're slave to climate at this point. The question that I have is, if this idea of control environment agriculture could create its own climates anywhere in the world, could you have the climate of Bordeaux in Libya? Could you have the climate of, you know, Napa in Australia? And so the next question for the work is, what if we could email a tomato? And what I mean by that is, thank you, one second. That's good. What I mean by that is, could we create enough discrete data about a physical object to create a true cyber physical system? Could I gather enough data about that apple, or in this case, you know, vegetables, send that data to somebody else on the other side and have them grow the same thing? And I'll show you what I mean in the work. The last question is, a lot of people spend time in, you know, talking about the future of cities, saying by 2050 we'll have, you know, 9 billion people, and I always wonder what those other 2 billion people will be doing. So what if 1 billion of those people could be farmers? And if you look right now, you know, these few quotes have been a part of my work and inspired me. So when I went to Fukushima after the disaster, when I landed that day in Japan, the headlines read, "Agriculture has no money, no youth, and no future." It's not unique to Japan. 2% of the United States population is directly involved in farming. 50% of Africa's population is under 18. 80% of them don't want to be farmers. You know, life of a small shareholder farmer is very difficult. So the last one, in India, you know, it's uncomfortable to talk about, but there's been more farmer suicides in the last 3 years than in the previous 10. So those families not being able to have access to basic infrastructure are giving up on farming and heading into the city. When the average age of the farmer globally is 65, we know we're in a huge point of knowledge that's being lost. So how could 1 billion farmers take the place of the current farmers in agriculture? So we know we need a platform. I'll go through this quickly because you're an educated audience on the Fab Lab network. But we're building platforms. This is where I think agriculture is right now. You know, that the 1950s of computing. So there's big, complicated machines. Only a few, or in this case, one person really understands how to manipulate them, and we have potential for catastrophic failure, which is kind of what we're doing right now. And of course, the big step forward in this was making the computer personal. So when I think about the platforms, I'm thinking, at this time with computing, people said, oh, you'll do calculations faster, you'll do your taxes faster. It's a calculator. What it really was to connect a lot of different people to share their knowledge and to share their passion and their interests and their personality. So after they kind of freed into personal computing, you have folks like Richard Stallman, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, building Linux. I haven't mentioned yet, but all of our work is open source, and we're really following this lineage of the personal computer, the open source software. Like, our support for this is coming from lots of big food companies, big retail companies, but also tech companies. So it looks a lot like the beginning of the kernel of Linux. And the last one you're all super familiar with is the transition from industrial manufacturing to discrete manufacturing, and what you've all been working on. And we're taking a lot of cues in our work from the beginning of RepRap. And you'll see the personal food computer in a minute that we've been working on, but it has this same idea. We want a community of development. We want people to supply mods that integrate well and to really open it up. And the last one is this transition. Agriculture is still a very industrial economy. 30 years ago, the call was for more cheap food. And then we had the Green Revolution, we had vertical integration of machinery, and that allowed us to produce a whole lot very cheaply. What the agricultural economy has not yet done, and so you can lead, is the transition into the network economy. No one really knows yet how a production system in agriculture benefits from 1 billion users. There is no Airbnb of agriculture yet. There is no Uber. So how do we turn it around from a game where we've just been, the people that have won in agriculture have aggregated land, aggregated, gotten huge $1 million pieces of equipment, created only one crop, got specialized in that, and shipped it all over the world. But how could agriculture function like a network? So we're going coder movement, maker movement, network movement that have all happened or are happening. And we're calling this the food movement, or the access to digital biology. So these are the tools that we're working on. Food labs to create knowledge, food operating systems to create informations, and a food web to share it. This was about 5 years ago in my journey. My background is I design data centers and hospitals. I'm a specialist, an architectural and engineering specialist for clean room design. And when I visited Fukushima, I saw a landscape that was contaminated with radiation and salt, whose young people had gone to Sendai or Tokyo, and Japan as a country already imported 70% of its own food. So what I saw the need for was a data center for food. I had built huge data centers before, so I knew it was possible. So I came home, started hacking these little prototypes, and very much in the early hacker stuff. We then kind of transitioned that into a lab that we built at MIT. Sorry for the video, I'm not sure why it's hitching like that, but I don't know, it's kind of disco, so I guess you'll go with it. The interesting thing about that lab, the technology is cool, and we can talk about it, but I think the ability to have a harvest inside of the media lab with bright, deep green colors. This was the first time a lot of people in the media lab had ever ripped the roots off of anything, and it was grown only 40 feet away. And so this kind of started our imaginations going and saying, okay, how much food can we produce? How can we integrate the skills of the media lab, robotics engineering, data science, algorithm design? Obviously, Neil was a huge inspiration for me. How do I put these things together? One thing I learned in that very early lab was we would have these harvests and we would take the lettuce out to give to people. And if there was some left over, we would take it back. And so every time we took it back into the lab, the next day it would taste sweeter. And so we started doing a lot of analysis, and I thought someone was messing around with my farm. So I put up cameras, and this is an example of a water analysis that we were running, looking for different levels of pH or alkalinity, or basically specific ions that were responsible for this sweetness. Turns out we were just technologists kind of falling backwards into plant physiology, and any plant under stress creates a chemical response. In this case, we were creating a drought stress by taking it out of its environment, and that drought stress made the plant try to protect itself. And the plant biochemically protecting itself tastes sweeter to me. So we accessed the production of some volatile that then changed the flavor profile in a day. And the truth is, one lettuce, one set of genetic information can produce thousands of variations of flavor, color, texture, morphology, physiology. So we wanted to create kind of you might call it a climate decoder, or an ability to create a lot of climates in one box, record those climates, and then grow things in them so that we knew what they expressed. What was it about all the different stresses that we could create nutrition and flavor? So hopefully this video plays a little better. Nope. Okay, so this lab is still on the facade of the media lab. It's a little bit different now. But there are about 30 points of network sensing per plant. Things like CO2, O2, temperature, humidity. If you know about the genome and gene physics, this is the phenome or epigenetics. So there are millions of different expressions that all of these plants can have. And so by recording the phenomena that exists around the genetic information, it really starts to tell us how to push different proteins, how to push different flavor volatiles, different nutrition compounds. So by coding the phenome, we can then push the genetics kind of through their own technology to produce what we're looking for. So we've created a little UI for this now that we're working through to make it better. But this is to help people kind of get started. If you notice in this slide under environment, it says resource efficient. So that means that we're running a recipe, that this recipe is designed to be resource efficient, whether for water resource or energy, electrical energy resource. Of course, you can see all the plants, and in this case, it's in a food computer, one of our smaller units. I haven't shown you yet, but you can see all the plants. You can scrub back and forth. You can add notes. Of course, we're running all of this data. This is all through Raspberry Pi and Arduino. We've created a few shields that are on our GitHub that you can make quite easily, and then you'll be up and running with the UI. So when I talk to you about all those data streams, you can add as many as you want, and you can see, here's a graph of them in our app. There's a web-based app that's compiling all of them. This blue line is the recipe line at this point. Right, we're getting a lot of noise, still a lot of noise to try to keep, water temperature, light intensity, light spectrum, water EC, all of these different variables to try to conform to this line. So that's a little bit of what we're working on right now, is tightening that up. And of course, if you line them all up at once, you see that it's this confluence of things that has created that plant. So this is the plant recipe. This is the thing that we export to someone else and allow them to do the same thing. And then maybe they tweak it just a little bit by changing a set point. All of that information is then correlated to a plant's personal kind of page. So if you look at it, here are all the plants that were growing in that food computer that day. Each one of them has their own page where photos are taken, where you're given indications. In this one, a new leaf came in today because we're using cameras and we're using edge detection algorithms for those cameras. You can also do things like image-based processing for color differential, for hyperspectral images, using LiDAR, just every non-invasive way that you could imagine to produce data off of that plant while it's growing. You know, agricultural models right now are pretty poor for making direct correlations. And this is a lot of variables to try to correlate on a biologic organism. So the more data we can produce, the more that it can be in real time, and the more it can be associated with that recipe that gets sent to someone else, the better. So this is the lab on the facade. Actually, it looks even different now, but what you can see is what's happened in the process is we've created kind of a structure. So in this one, you know, this bay here is set up, if you can see my mouse, I'm not sure. This is set up for cotton. These are set up for medium-sized crops, and these for small crops. We call this the FoodServer, which is a little bit bigger model, but it's the same thing. Like, you can change this to ask any question you want. If you want to do only tall crops, if you want to do only small ones, it's the same system, different subcomponents. One of those subcomponents, you know, people get really caught up in aeroponics. And in the field of hydroponics, or in the field of farming in general, this is just sub-irrigation technology. So whether you're doing dirt and you're spraying that dirt with water, you're using inert media and you're dripping in that inert media like most greenhouses do, or you're doing very shallow water along the bottom of a tray, we call that nutrient film technology, or you're doing maybe 2 inches of water standing in a tray, call that shallow water culture, raft hydroponics. All the way down to deep water cultures, to low pressure aeroponics, to high pressure. If you look on this slide, what you're seeing is in our high pressure systems, we're getting about 120 PSI into this system, and they produce about 50 micron sized droplets of water. There's no standing water and no soil. Roots at a simplistic level only need water, oxygen, and minerals. So that gives them maximum access to all of those things, and at a level at which the tertiary root hair, or the little tiny bitty root hairs, can be activated and can be taking up water. So what you get is massively increased growth in a system like this, about 4 to 5 times faster growth, and you also get the ability to tune the flavors very much. Speaking of flavors, in control environment systems where you're creating climate, you can access a lot of germplasm diversity, or what we call seed banks. So things like Svalbard's Rare Seed Bank, or Seed Savers Exchange, or any heirloom rare hybrid seed that you get your hands on, you can bring into this system. So these tomatoes, for example, hadn't been grown commercially in 150 years. They came from a rare seed bank. They were supposedly the best tomato sauce tomatoes in the world. The great thing is, if you're getting commercial tomatoes now, they've been bred for the industrial supply chain. They've been bred not for flavor. They've not been bred for nutrition. They've been bred to survive an industrial process, which they needed to do. But with these kinds of environments that we can create, you can bring in a whole new genetic diversity of information of seed that we haven't gotten to use in a long time. On the other side here, we've started doing a bit of protein research. The world is in a dearth of protein. So if you can start doing better peas and legumes, hybridizing things to get a better quality protein to use in new foods, you're going to be a needed person for the next 100 years as we transition off of primarily animal-based proteins. So I told you we were putting minerals into the water. So I wanted to give you an example. In the FoodServer, we use these passive chemical dosers where water pressure builds up on one side until it pops a diaphragm, and then it injects whatever it is that we've set out. So you could make your own compost tea if you want. You could use synthetic fertilizer. You could use organic fertilizer. You could use fish and fish waste. You could kind of do whatever you want. In our case, we have one kind of container that has the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium, the primary 3 ingredients that you need, the macronutrients. Then we have another container that contains micronutrients, so things like boron, copper, iron, magnesium. And the last one contains an acid because the water is too basic. More than that, though, we're starting to explore kind of the microbiological information that's in our system. And so MIT's announcement of this, launching the Center of the Microbiome, we're now looking at the root microbiome to understand what kind of microbes and bacteria and virus are present, which ones are normally present in soil, and can we culture back whatever's missing. So in an effort to do that, we started a recent collaboration with, out of one of our food computers here, I'll show you in a minute, and Ginkgo Bioworks and Restaurant Noma. So this is one of Restaurant Noma's flavor chemists, and what we did was culture the plant. So when you look at those Petri dishes, what you're seeing are different cultures of different parts of the plant. So if you look at this lowermost one, it says bean root. And so this is the root of the plant. You can see there's a lot of different activity going on as we culture this out. As you move up these dishes, you're basically moving up the plant. So in here you're having, I think, leaf, well, you're having what's alive in the water. So this is what's alive on the roots. This is what's alive in the water around it. And then these two are what's alive in a cutting of the plant. And then what's alive on the leaf of the plant. So you can see it's a lot less dense as you transition up the plant. And so now we've taken all of this information and sequenced it and are starting to compare root microbiome with soil microbiome. So this is a wide open field if you're interested in something that you can do inside of a food computer. So these were first generation food computers. They were part of one of my students' mechanical engineering thesis, Camille. We've progressed that a lot. We went through many different iterations, all open source, all different technologies we were playing with. And about 4 months ago, we landed on this guy, which if you go to our website, I can send you the information about how you can build one, but with a small caveat that we're about to release a better one. So in this guy, you have a control environment. We call it the personal food computer. You have a control environment, like a greenhouse, and then you have your kind of sets of actuators, so different peristaltic pumps that are controlling water. You have heaters. Here's a heater. You have a humidifier. This was a CO2 kind of, I don't know, what do you call it? Bioreactor, where we were taking yeast and creating CO2 and controlling that. And of course, everything being run off the backbone of a Raspberry Pi, Arduino, and Shield. And a number of sensors that are going into the environment. So we're collecting the data, we're able to look at it, say what we want to change, and then make some kind of actuation. Our idea for this was that you from the Fab Academy and all other folks around the world would start making mods, making it smarter, making it better, and sharing your mods online. So we designed this. If you see this board right here, that board lies vertically here, and we call that the motherboard. So taking that motherboard, removing some components, putting some new components on without having to change the structure of the chassis. We then took that food computer and made about 10 of them and put them out in schools from 7th to 11th grade. And some amazing things happened. One teacher took the food computer and then took farmer data, farmer's almanac data from 50 years ago, and tried to set the climate in the food computer to the climate that existed that day 50 years ago. And then the kids grew plants. The students grew plants in those conditions. Then they took the rest of the semester to project a climate that would be 50 years in the future and grow the same plants so that they could see what chemically changed, what morphologically changed, what physically changed from the climate of the past to the climate of the future. And this was in a class where they were talking about impacts of climate change. We had other folks that only worked on the code, you know, learning and teaching Python for the Arduino and Raspberry Pi and teaching Arduino code. So everything from kind of the electrical components to the biological components. We created a little Unity app for the version that we went out in schools with. And in this Unity app, you had the virtual environment, the sensor information, and the actuators. You could select a recipe that some other student had grown, plant that recipe, physically plant the seedling, and then let the recipe run. As the recipe was running, you could change things like light panel or humidifier or water or color of light, and it was logging that information. When you would harvest one of these plants out of our Unity app and then physically harvest it, you create a derivative recipe. So you now had your own recipe. You could download all the data from that recipe, share it as a CSV, make graphs out of it, or package it as a digital plant recipe, and which is something that we've been working on for the last few months of how to do that. So you can find a lot of documentation again on our GitHub. This is 3 weeks of growth in a food computer at an elementary school. You can imagine all of the things that you could do with image data, if that's something that you're into, simply through the webcams that are already installed and some of the control software. So we've run things like edge detection algorithms to do new growth. We've done hyperspectral imaging to look at chlorofluorescence from the infrared. We've used LiDAR to try to get point cloud data from these plants. We've been having a lot of fun, and I think it's a great area of exploration. We've created a lot of new farmers in the process. I think people that didn't expect or want to be farmers can understand how this sort of platform would let you contribute in a new way. So like I said, we open source a lot of this. You can also check out our website, openag.mit.edu. This is a build video together with our tutorials, our component parts. I want to let you know that this is, let's say, the most hacker-friendly version, because you can get everything at a local hardware store or on Amazon. It's not cheap. You're going to run about $1,500 to build this, unless you have some of the components yourself. We are releasing a version 2 this summer that incorporates digital manufacturing tools. So it incorporates the CNC, the laser cutter, the Modella Miller, to really make it a lot easier and a lot more uniform. But we released this one first. It was a little bit more of a kit of parts. And the next one, the version 2, like I said, in the summer. If I were you on the Fab Academy, I mean, if you're freaking out and you want to build this, you should do it. There's about 50 people in the world building them now and running them together. But if you can stand to wait till the summer, it's going to be a lot easier to put it together, and it'll be a better food computer. If you're wondering who's a part of my team, this is my team. There are electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, computer scientists, data scientists, plant scientists, architects, urban planners. I guess that's about it. Writers. So it's a very kind of all disciplines approach to creating these platforms. Something that we're starting to build now, together with a bunch of partners, is a version that fits in a warehouse. So we have the little one, we have the medium one, the size of a shipping container, and now we're building the big one. And I think, you know, if you look around of what's going on right now in this space, this was aboard the International Space Station just a few weeks ago, where they were doing lettuce experiments. And you might think that this technology is kind of, you know, should be used there, or in colonization of Mars, and it is. But it's actually also being built all over the world, if you didn't know. This was an installation in Canada called Verticrop. And you can see multi-layered control environment system trying to produce some leafy greens. This is a video I took in Japan just a few weeks ago inside of a plant factory that was about 3,000 square meters, 19 layers to the ceiling, and produced 1 million heads of lettuce a week. Additionally, I think Japan's probably a world leader right now for this technology. You have about 400 hectares under cultivation this way. This is inside a Toshiba floppy disk factory that's been converted into a lettuce factory. This is in Munich. It's a multi-layer prawn farm. So if you go inside, the conditions inside the building feel like a mangrove forest. And inside they're cultivating these beautiful, beautiful blue shrimp that are kind of a very premium shrimp. And so it's moving not just from kind of the lettuce and leafy greens, but now into more complex organisms and animals. The last one that I want to show you is this facility that's a DARPA facility. This facility is growing plant substrate that they then inoculate with the tobacco mosaic virus to produce a very specific protein. That protein is Ebola resistant. And so they harvest that protein to create vaccines. So you also have this kind of interesting relationship with pharmaceutical natural derivatives, cosmetic natural derivatives, nutraceutical or homeopathic natural derivative, and then all the way down to lettuce and leafy greens, and then now just starting to get into cellular cultivation of more complex organisms. So whether that's the prawn or that's synthetic meat cultured in a control environment, it's really starting to open up a really wide range. But this is kind of the big problem in my space at the moment. No one's sharing anything. They all think that their technology is really special. So it's a really knee-jerk reaction to start building some of this technology and then think you should have a startup right away and put it on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, which is fine. The problem is none of them actually really work the way they say they do because it's early. It's early days where we need a lot of people thinking about this, a lot of people asking questions to create better solutions. At the same time, the general customer in food, all the people have stopped trusting food. Call it the Monsanto effect or call it the GMO literacy effect. People just don't trust anything that big food companies are telling them. So it's undoubtable that the future of food is radically transparent and that it will be built on open platforms. And at the same time, all the big companies that you think would be trying to lobby against it, they really can't. They'll try, but they know they want to sell food. So you have here McDonald's launching transparency campaigns on the Chicken McNugget, the most mysterious food item of all time. And now you have a major, major player in fast food already jumping on, telling you what's in it, how good is it for you, where did it come from, does it have antibiotics in it? The future of food is going to be about information, radically transparent information. And to create a lot of information, we need a lot of users. Of course, we're following the open source trend with, folks like Elon taking his platform open. I don't have to tell this to the Fab Lab network. You guys are all over it already. With Apple app developer, Android app developer, of course, all of the how to make almost anything, and the relationships between things like Linux and Red Hat being quite profitable now. So this is a concept of our new food computer, in which you saw the last version. This is a concept version we've been working on with an industrial designer to give it a little bit more standardization, and you'll see this released in just a few months. We call this FoodServer. They're the size of a shipping container. The cost on these right now is roughly $1,500. We're trying to get it cheaper through industrial manufacturing. We could use all the help we can get. The cost on these guys right now is anywhere between $80,000 and $100,000. So they're very expensive. And so I think the more of us that can try to build them, that can share our information about how to build them, we can bring the cost down significantly. And the last one we call Food Data Center. The interesting thing about these technologies is people think that the technology scales between the little one, the medium one, and the big one. Sort of true, sort of not true. It's certainly not linear. So for us, what does scale is the climate recipe, the climate data, or as we call it, the open phenome. So if you think of open genome and what that's done for the advancements of science, we're working on creating the open phenome, the phenome data of all living things and the way that they express. And we know that's a huge undertaking that will take maybe generations, depending on how fast we go. But that's what you can be a part of creating, is building these machines together, making the machines more efficient, making them better, and then taking and recording that data, making it publicly available so that we can do advanced data analytics on it, so that we can do data visualizations that help us understand how to push our food in better ways. Maybe there'll be data that relates directly to conventional agriculture to make it better. Maybe there'll be data about how it interacts with our human genetics, these new biochemicals that we're able to produce, or larger levels of them. You know, I wonder, it's a pretty known fact that a lot of our nutrition and food in the industrial system has attenuated, maybe 50%. So if we're eating 50% less optimized food, then we're 50% less optimized humans, because we are the same thing. We are the connection of our genes, also the expressions of those genes. That's why, you know, we're skinnier or we're bigger. You know, that's why we're taller, shorter. That's why our hair, you know, is sometimes better, or our fingernails. So if we're eating 50% less optimized food, what happens when we eat 150% more optimized food? So if we're producing better food, better kind of nutrition, better flavors, will we become better humans, is a question that I have about the relationship to human genome. So I'll sum it up. This is where we're at right now, a world with dots that are connected by planes, trains, and automobiles. That's the industrial agricultural revolution in action. So what we're hoping to change about the world is to bring some of these cities online, to start sharing information about food, to email their tomatoes to each other. And this is where we already have different deployments going on. So in Guadalajara, we've helped a group, and actually they did almost everything themselves, to build a FoodServer inside of another university, and they've got that up and going, and we share information and data with them. In Anjar, we're building a cotton growing facility with a big cotton producer, the first cotton growing facility like this in the world, on the network, open source, sharing data. In Italy, we've brought over a food computer and built one with a fab group at a food innovation program. So this kind of network is what's starting to happen, and that's a network of sharing hardware, sharing software, and sharing data about food. So I would close with saying the future of food is no longer about calling out what's wrong. That's what people have been doing for 10 years. You know, oh, this is bad, that's bad, and this debilitating conversation of how big everything is, and saying, oh, well, it's climate change, and okay, let's get the governments together to reduce climate change. I don't think that that conversation is the future. The future is connecting and networking the next 1 billion farmers on platforms that create knowledge for them and create knowledge for the community, and that we can bank that knowledge in the cloud, that we can put a farmer's brain in the cloud for us to leverage as a resource. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you, Caleb. You got Neil.
Hi, Caleb.
Hey, Neil.
Good. Always a pleasure to hear you talk. Why don't you go back to video now? Yeah, so I always enjoy hearing you talk about this. For the Fab Academy group, I wanted to make 3 points of connection.
Okay.
The first is understand this very exactly as mainframes, mini computers, PCs, mass manufacturing, down to personal manufacturing. This is that for food, so you shouldn't view it as occupying one point. You should view it as creating this whole tree from, you know, PDAs of food to PCs of food to mini computers of food to mainframes of food. And in the same way for manufacturing, sort of all points in that tree have a role. It's not monolithic, is one comment.
Yeah.
Second comment is we had a really interesting visit with Caleb's group and the machine builders working with me. And coming out of that is the observation that I'd say 90–95% of the food computer is exactly the same sort of ingredients as the machines that make machines. And so there's a really interesting convergence coming together where you shouldn't view the food computer as way off in a different part of parameter space. It's just a different composition of rapid prototyping, and we really want to flow those together so that you don't have to reinvent all the technology from scratch, but it's sort of a different composition of exactly what we're talking about in machine building. Is the second thought. And then the third thought is, one reason I was so pleased to have Caleb join is the picture you've all seen of Barcelona's mayor making the 40-year commitment to urban self-sufficiency. This project may be the single most important ingredient of that. When we say digital fabrication for, the bits come and go, the atoms stay, it includes making things like furniture and consumer electronics, but this next step of building the machines that make food really is this profound implication on urban self-sufficiency. And so I view the food computer as possibly the most important project of the Fab City project that Tomas is helping coordinate.
I would add too, Neil, other forms of biofabrication, it's like a company like Modern Meadow. I don't know if you've seen what Modern Meadow is up to, but essentially it's just cell replication of mammalian cells to create, at this point, leather. And they're doing it up in New York on the Army Pier. But that's the same exact technology that it's a control environment. It's a control environment plus some sort of structuring for the cells. In our case, we're using the proteins from the roots. So we're taking the root protein, extracting it out, and using it as a lattice and an attractor for the mammalian cells to create new, in this case, leather, but could be meat. There's a whole movement behind this now, from producing oysters in control environments to producing, like we were showing, some of the other food products like prawn. So I really think it can get into the complex microorganisms and macroorganisms to produce some really interesting things.
Right, it's all fabrication.
The other thing I'll mention too is the rise of kind of fermentation experimentation. So what Noma is up to, that's why we partnered with them, is they bring a lot of knowledge in brewing, in fermentation, which all happens in control environments as well. And frankly, the control environments for makers in that space right now are pretty poor in terms of the information they create, so that they could do that experiment again, for example, or share that experiment with someone else. So I think we can kind of combine a lot of these things together.
Yeah. And finally, to relate all of that to the research frontier, one of my students, James Pelletier, was on the paper with JCVI that just came out on the minimal genome, which was the 473 gene cell. And it's essentially microcode programming. It's difficult microcode programming because, as one of my students said, it's all spaghetti code. But designing a genome is actually just a couple steps away from what we're covering. And so that's the research much further down, but it's part of this continuum.
Cool.
But so with those, I really wanted to make this connection that what Caleb is talking about is rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping, but the end effector makes food. Connecting to what we're doing, and I hope it inspires people. I'll drop off now. Tomas will go through the questions, and I'll listen in from the video stream.
Thank you, Neil. Caleb, thank you very much for the lecture again. I'm gonna go through some questions that people is posting in the Fab Academy Google Plus chat. There is one that are somehow I would say skeptical. No, Elia de Tomasi, he's saying that who benefits from the application of these technologies in large scale? Farmers, citizens, or Monsanto and friends, he says. And what he comments, what I see is horrifying me, is the final attack of industry to agriculture. They did it with animal farming, and now we succeed with agriculture. I think you answered somehow that, but.
Yeah, so first of all, these data sets, like I'm trying to create, They don't exist in the public domain, any of them. The only data sets like this that exist are in big pharma companies, in agriculture companies, and in seed companies. So when I say, you know, democratizing food, and you see this weird machine and you're like, oh my God, this is the most dystopic version of the future. To produce these data sets that allow people to answer fundamental scientific questions, I am not predicting exactly what they're going to do. But for example, we might learn that there were areas of the world that we cultivated for specific crops, like wheat or corn or rice or cotton. And that those areas of the world, by studying those, imagine we had sensors in the real world and we were recreating that climate from the real world in the box. As we grow through all of these things that weren't chosen for industrial production, we might learn that actually in this area of the world, with this climate data that we're already able to scrub from GIS data as well, like putting this together would have provided a much better outcome for a conventional farmer. And the fact that those data sets would be open source would allow that information to get down to that farmer. I would also say that it's a really tempting thing to say, let's go back to nature. Farming is not natural. Just get it, understand it, accept it. It never was. This is what we did to conquer the environment as humans. This was part of the first agricultural revolution when we bred plants to stay in one place. We've been on that path for a really long time. Breeding plants, then the horse and the plow, and then technology in farming. So if you understand that farming in and of itself is inherently unnatural, then the next question is, how do we make it less environmentally impactful? And how do we use the food that we created to create healthier people? So this idea that we would go back to little tiny farms and that that's going to feed 9 billion people, of which 50 to 75% will live in cities, it's a fantasy. So we have to take these two worlds that are in a lot of friction right now. The return to nature world, where we feel good about it, but we're kind of generally ignorant about food, and then the big food world that stepped in to solve a problem a long time ago. So there's going to have to be a way that we create a consensus, and I think that's through a platform. So if you think that this is not natural, prove it. Prove it. Get on the platform, grow some stuff, create some data, show, you know, it doesn't have to be, you could put dirt in the food computer. It can be geoponic. Like, put dirt in it, use all organic nutrients, and show the difference of the things that you were able to grow, so that you're not just firing off, you know, dismissive comments before you really have the knowledge that it takes. And I think having so many diversity of thought, having people from all around the world express their morals, express their ethics, express their science, express their engineering, that's how we'll yield a solution.
I think it's quite interesting that you just cover a couple of questions related to what about the biodiversity, you know, and this big question about the romanticism about agriculture, thinking about it as something that is good to grow naturally the food outside in the land, no? What actually is that way of growing food that is causing the major problems, the environmental problems in the earth, right?
Yeah, I mean, is it romantic to chemically fertilize a field, because we do that, and then have that most of that go into the groundwater, or most of that go into the pond next door? No, I don't think so. So I think it's actually quite romantic what we do. I know that might sound weird at first, but I'm sitting inside of a lab, inside of a major city. I'm from a farming background. My family's in agriculture. I couldn't have 2,000 plants growing and feeding people any other way. So like, I'm responsible for the life of 2,000 plants, how they do, you know, how they express, what do they taste like, and I get to give them away to food shelters, to, you know, different grocery stores, to people in the lab. So I think that there's a lot of poetry in that. You know, like in the farm, you asked the question about biodiversity. Of course, you know, people are like, oh, it's a clean room. it's not a clean room. Like there are many living things in there, whether that's bacteria, microbes, virus, whether that's other organisms that we've planted. And I'll give you an example. We have tomatoes, right, that grow. Tomatoes need to be pollinated. So we'll either bring in lacewings, insects, and release the insects inside of the box to do pollination, or we manually pollinate them with a toothbrush. So we go in and we shake the plant, and I mean, tell me what's more intimate than creating a tomato with a plant? There really isn't anything more than that. So
it's human pollination of tomatoes.
Human pollination.
I want to tackle back in a comment that Neil was mentioning, this multi-scalars ecosystem. And in the case of fabrication, we can think about from the 3D printing in your house to the local fab lab to the city-scale factory to the factory in Shenzhen in China, right? And it was interesting that you mentioned, this kind of domestic scale machine to grow food in your house. You mentioned the server, right? And then somehow you have like at the city scale, the data center, right? And what is really interesting as well is that the server is the same, more or less the same price as a fab lab.
Yeah.
and until today, there are questions about, how many people does a fab lab serve? So do you have the same question? How many people does a server farm serve?
So, serve is a relative term, I guess. People want to know from the server farm how many people could eat out of it and survive. And that's because they really don't understand how much food it takes and diversity of food it takes to keep someone alive. So, we're talking about things being produced in these that are about 30 to 40% of a average person's diet, because that's how much they eat in fruits and vegetables that could be produced in control environments. So in terms of that, the next choice is, what's your goal? So when I think of the FoodServer, I see a technology platform that can be asked questions. If your goal is to feed one person or 5 people their entire diversity, then you need to have tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and lettuce and beans and peas and fruit all in one box, which is fine. You can do that, and I think it's fun to do. It's complex. It's very complex. But it means your algorithm for making that the most efficient would have to take into account all of these different crops and their desired climates and try to make an average climate, which I think is a great, hard problem. Or if your goal is to produce as much protein as you can, then you would create a box full of peas or full of beans, and then that might be added into new food for other people. Or if you just want to create a lot of basil, you might have, it's a platform that you can ask questions on and experiment. It's not a box for like the apocalypse, which is kind of how it seems sometimes. And I think the food computer too, the smaller one, the problem in that space right now is people are making these claims like, this box will feed you. That's, again, crazy, because it's 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot. It's half a meter, half a meter, half a meter. This box, I think 15 years from now, we might have these boxes in our house, and we might be getting a prescription from a doctor for specific bacteria that will produce very specific expressions in plants that will alter and affect our microbiomes. So I do think there will be relation between our food and our genetic and our biome information. And I think that might happen on a small scale, but it won't be what feeds you. So I don't know. Sorry, just keep going.
Yeah, that's great. No, it gives me an idea. We should build, around the 600 Fab Labs that we have in the world, we should have a FoodServer as a goal for the coming years. That would be amazing. If every Fab Lab could produce,
even just a food, start with a food computer in every Fab Lab, because they're easier, they're cheaper.
Because I think they follow kind of the same role, no, on creating this, opening the questions and opening the space to rethink about food, production of things, production of energy, and everything that sustains life in cities. No, I want to finish up with a question that more or less summarizes the other people's question. Is What about the connection with other kind of systems, let's say? No? What happens with when we think about food beyond the food itself, with the social implications, the economic implications, the environmental, the waste management? I mean, this is more like a systems thinking approach within this scenario in which we have open source food production. How do you envision that?
So first I'll say that I think of a lot of those questions as application questions and not necessarily kernel questions. And I think if you look back 10 years ago when they started talking about vertical farming, you know, it was always about the applications. People were like, here's a building with farms on it. And then it was really easy for people to say, well, that's not going to work. So I've kind of stopped working on applications for the moment, and I've been working on that kernel. And I think that's the kind of development that is most important right now. Spending your time thinking about imagining what the machine would do versus building them and then testing it. I would encourage you to just build them and get into them and start hacking them, and then you'll find out. But what you'll find out is pretty interesting. You know, what I've found out after running these machines for a long time, you know, I'm not worried about electrical energy. First of all, I mean, I am about heating and cooling. Like, I didn't realize in the beginning that the biggest cost when we did the analytics from all of the energy we used was the HVAC. The heating, air conditioning cost of these units is by far the highest. Before you get, it's 2 levels in before you get to the LEDs. Everyone's like, oh, the LEDs, that can't be possibly, you know, environmentally conscious. It's using energy. It's using a very small amount of energy, and it's going to keep getting smaller because we're learning about the correlation between the color of light and the growth of the plant. Eventually, I'd say in the next 5 years, we get to single wavelength isolation, where we only need to produce a very, very tiny bit of targeted light to produce the plants. So when I'm running them, I'm thinking a lot about heating and cooling, which then tells me maybe they should be buried. Maybe the smartest thing is we should be burying them so that the ambient temperature is quite constant and we're not spending a lot of energy, which gives us the surface area to do things like put up solar, put up another method of energy collection. The thing I'm most worried about is not energy, but it's minerals. So, you know, when you get into this and you start seeing those minerals being used for the plants and then being uptaken, and then that you have to get rid of some, and really seeing it happen, you'll learn that nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, was a Nobel Prize, right? That is a very important thing. We can produce a lot of nitrogen. That's why a lot of nitrogen's been thrown on fields. Phosphorus is another story altogether. So phosphorus is only mined. There is no synthetic phosphorus. And so now it's controlled by, when you talk about big companies, you know, OCP, BASF, like the chemical companies that produce phosphorus are in control. The really interesting thing is, so that's how the world is now. I know of a few processes that have an industrial byproduct that contains phosphorus. So like making yogurt actually has a high phosphorus, high calcium slough product. You know, some chicken waste from massive chicken houses has this also. So I think we're going to be on a really interesting study of, you talk about the city, you know, the city and its waste streams. How many of those waste streams could be cleaned and used for agriculture? How many have to go to Blackwater and be processed? Could we reclaim nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, boron, copper? Could we be reclaiming that and using it in these machines? And I think that's an amazing study to do. Grab a food computer, grab some municipal waste, and see if you can get the chemicals to separate. That would be fun to me, and at least that would be progressing a conversation forward. The last one is really interesting. These boxes, when you operate them, you realize that plants are consuming, you know, we know this, but you don't realize it until you have them in a box. Plants are consuming CO2. Plants are producing O2. So we have to feed CO2 into the box, or the plants, the atmosphere will become O2 toxic for the plant. So if we have major farms buried underground in cities, we might also just be using them as HEPA filters for the city. basically very dense plant environments where we're consuming that CO2, we're separating the O2. So then imagine another project in a food computer. Thermodynamics. Can you separate the O2 off? Can you package that in some way? Do you just release it? Do you put it into a building to make the air quality better? How do you scrub CO2 from the ambient air of a city so that we're just getting CO2 and not all the other particulate? I think, these are the kinds of things that I think are relative to the city and the bigger infrastructural systems around farming.
Okay, I think that's a fantastic close remark on the larger implications of creating these systems at large scale, right? I don't know, Khaled. I mean, I think that you're gonna hear a lot from Fab Labs on growing food in the future, and I know there are some experiments being done in the Green Fab Lab and in other labs in Africa. So you probably they'll get in contact, and I encourage everyone to go and visit your website, the Open Agriculture group at MIT.
So the best thing to do is visit the website and then enter your email into the box there, because on the end of this week we'll launch all of our community development tools. And so we're just a little bit before that time. So if you put your email in there, you'll hear about the launch of kind of all of our platforms.
This is fantastic, and I'm looking forward also to relate it with the Fab City project as well, and I will be contacting you in relation to that. So thank you so much for joining us today, Caleb.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.